Hello, good evening, good day, everybody, wherever you are, and welcome to the third live episode of Geostrategy with Abhijit Chavda. I hope you're all doing very well. We're going to do a couple of really deep dives into two really important topics today. Today is the 5th of June. And what happened today? Here's what happened today. Today, in 1967, on this day, 5th of June, you had the Six-Day War, which was fought between Israel and a number of Arab nations. It was a brief war, 6 days, but it was a pretty decisive war, and it involved Israel and the Arab coalition of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. So it started with Israel launching a massive preemptive strike, Operation Focus, which destroyed over 90% of Egypt's air force within a few hours. And similarly, the air forces of the other two nations were also decimated by Israel. Israel gained air superiority, air dominance, complete air dominance. And then Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem. It reunified Jerusalem, and it captured the Golan Heights. The Sinai Peninsula was even eventually given back to Egypt, but the consequences of this war are immense, and they are still being played out today. So, what are the geopolitical consequences of the Six-Day War? So, first of all, there was a UN resolution 242, which introduced this land for peace formula. Secondly, Arab nationalism became a less dominant factor, and Palestinian nationalism became a more dominant factor as a consequence of this war. This war ended up strengthening the US Israel partnership. During the Cold War, the US started taking Israel really seriously after this massive military victory. And the territories that Israel captured during this war, they remain at the heart of the Israel Palestinian conflict that continues to this day. So, this is something that happened on this day, the 5th of June, 1967. Now, let us begin with the first topic of today. And this is a really serious topic. It's about how far are we from the Third World War? How far are we? I know that a lot of YouTubers, especially Indian YouTubers, like to put World War III everywhere in the titles and thumbnails. It's not a joke, it's a really serious issue. And we are not very far away from this. I mean, there is a massive flashpoint right now in Europe, which is the Ukraine war, the Ukraine conflict. And that is the war that has brought us the closest in recent times, in a long time, to the prospect of a nuclear exchange between various nations, which is the Third World War. So let's figure out how far or how close are we to a potential use of nuclear weapons, which could very much end up triggering the Third World War. So let's take a look at what has changed in recent times. It's all to do with nuclear doctrines. What's a nuclear doctrine? Well, nuclear doctrine is the way a nation approaches the potential use, or the decision not to use nuclear weapons, and this is all based on a very deep, profound understanding of the nation's own of its own national interests, of its security vulnerabilities, and of what it wants to do in case of attack, or various kinds of attack against it. What should it do when a small potentially a small nation attacks it? What should it do when a larger nation attacks it? What should it do when its territorial integrity potentially in the future comes under threat? What should it do if its sovereignty comes under threat, and so on and so forth? So there are a lot of considerations, a lot of factors that go into this. A lot of historical analysis goes into it. A lot of threat perception analysis, war gaming goes into this. Who are our biggest adversaries? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What are their capacities? What are their intentions? What will they do in what scenario, and so on and so forth? So all of this goes into structuring and formulating your nuclear doctrine. So Russia has had a nuclear doctrine for decades. Now, before the year 2024, Russia had a different nuclear doctrine, and it's around November last year that its doctrine was changed. So let's take a look at what Russia's nuclear doctrine was like before November 2024. So, first of all, Russia's nuclear doctrine had a defensive posture. Russia viewed nuclear weapons as a deterrent and an extreme measure to be used only under extraordinary circumstances. So that was the first pillar, so to say, of Russia's nuclear doctrine before November last year. Then Russia had four justifications. If any of these justifications was triggered, then it would definitely trigger a Russian nuclear response. So what were the four justifications, or the four red lines, so to say? The first red line for Russia was a ballistic missile attack on Russia by whoever. Now, why ballistic missile attack? It's because a ballistic missile is capable of delivering nuclear weapons, nuclear warheads. So when someone launches a ballistic missile towards you, you have no idea what's coming in the missile, right? You don't know whether it's a conventional warhead inside it, or it's a series of a package of multiple nuclear warheads. You have no idea. So if a ballistic missile is launched, then that is a serious red line. And that was the red line for Russia. That was the first red line for Russia. And you can tell whether a missile coming at you is a ballistic missile or a cruise missile or some other kind of missile. You can tell. A ballistic missile has a parabolic trajectory, right? And it goes outside the atmosphere and re-enters. So that's a ballistic missile launch. So a ballistic missile attack on Russia was one of the red lines before November 2024. Secondly, weapons of mass destruction used against Russia, whether it's nuclear or chemical or whatever other kind of weapon of mass destruction, or even conventional. So a weapon of mass destruction use, if it was used against Russia, that would trigger a Russian nuclear response. Number three, if there were strikes that would compromise potentially Russia's nuclear response, that would justify a Russian nuclear attack. Let's say there was a strike against Russia's nuclear warhead storage sites, or Russian strategic bombers, or Russian submarines, which carry Russian cruise missiles and so on, ballistic missiles. So that would trigger a Russian nuclear response. Or if there was an existential threat of some kind to the Russian nation, that would also then justify Russian nuclear response. So these were the four justifications, or four red lines. And the doctrine left open the option for Russia to use nuclear weapons first if severe conditions were met. For example, India has a no first use policy, which means that India, no matter what happens, will not use nuclear weapons first. It will only respond to the use of nuclear weapons, but India won't initiate the use of nuclear weapons. So Russia had kept this option open, the option of first use, if severe conditions were met. So this was Russia's nuclear doctrine before November 2024. Then what happened? And yeah, these are the red lines that I spoke about: ballistic missile attack, missile strikes against Russia or its allies, weapons of mass destruction used against Russia, nuclear or any other kind, strikes that would disable nuclear response capability. So command systems also are included in that, right? And existential threats of various kinds. Conventional attacks also were included in this, which could potentially threaten Russia's survival as a nation. So these were the Russian red lines. Now something happened in November 2024, which is last year. What happened? Let's find out. So there was a revision of Russia's nuclear doctrine in November last year. I think it was around the 19th of November last year. And this revision of the doctrine lowered the threshold at which Russia could potentially use nuclear weapons. So earlier it was a critical threat to earlier it was existential threat to the Russian nation that would prompt a Russian nuclear response. Now it's that language has been changed to critical threat to sovereignty. So it's no longer an existential threat to Russia's existence that would require a nuclear response. Now it is a critical threat to Russia's sovereignty. So even if the existence of Russia is not being threatened, but if the sovereignty of Russia is being threatened, then it would prompt a Russian nuclear response. So that's the first revision, the first amendment that happened. Now, what's the second thing? The second thing is that in this revision, in this new doctrine, Russia's nuclear umbrella explicitly extended to Belarus as a Union state member. So it essentially treats Belarus as any threat to Belarus as a threat to Russia. So Belarus comes under Russia's nuclear protection umbrella. Now, then there was the Western backing clause, which says that attacks by non-nuclear states on Russia, backed by nuclear powers, may be treated as joint attacks, and then there would be potentially a breach of the red line. So now, what does it mean? If it means that if Ukraine launches a massive attack on Russia, Ukraine doesn't have nuclear weapons, but Ukraine is backed by NATO. It's backed by various nuclear weapons powers. How many do we have in NATO? You have the US, the major one. Then you have the UK, and you have France as well. So if, and we know that the Ukraine war is a proxy war between NATO and Russia, and Ukraine is backed by NATO. There's no secret to that. So if Ukraine launches a massive strike of some kind on Russia, then it could trigger, it could be treated as a red line being crossed. It will be treated as a joint attack by Russia. Then the last revision is that the last major point of the revision is that a large scale air or missile attack, or large scale air or missile attacks which cross Russian borders, may again prompt a nuclear response. So these are the amendments that were made in November last year as a response to the evolving battle space and the evolving threat perception which was coming from Ukraine and its Western backers, its Western allies. So what does this mean? What's the ambiguity here? There is strategic ambiguity in the revised nuclear doctrine, the revised Russian nuclear doctrine. And there is some message, some signal, a bunch of signals that are being sent to the US and to NATO. So first of all, there's deliberate ambiguity, which leaves the door open to multiple interpretations. So vague language like critical threat gives Russia flexibility to justify a nuclear response to a wider range of situations. Earlier, it was the existence of the nation coming under threat, which is pretty clear what it means. But what's a critical threat to Russia's sovereignty? That has a wider range of interpretations, right? So this can be used, this more ambiguous language can be used by Russia to justify a nuclear response to a wider range of situations. And this creates uncertainty for the NATO planners, decision makers, about what actions might trigger Russia's use of nuclear weapons. And what was the Western response to this doctrinal change by Russia? So the US, the UK, and the EU condemned the doctrine as irresponsible nuclear saber rattling. And NATO, as we know, has continued supporting Ukraine, and it has avoided, matching Russia's nuclear rhetoric. So NATO hasn't changed any policy or doctrine, and it has not issued any threats as such. And so that's been the NATO response, and there's been no actual change that's been observed in Russia's actual nuclear force posture, despite the rhetoric. So thus far, it looks like the change has happened on paper. There's no actual visible change that's visible on the ground, in Russia's actual nuclear force posture. But that doesn't mean that there's no change. So now, what's going on right now in recent times? So now it looks like Russia's nuclear red lines are being tested. So Russia's thresholds, like we saw, are now a little blurry. There's ambiguity, right? And then there's the question, therefore, as to whether the recent Ukrainian attacks, successful attacks on Russia, very successful attacks on Russia in the past week, have any of these attacks crossed any of Russia's nuclear red lines? We're discussing the possibility of World War III. This is the core of the issue. This is the heart of the issue. So first of all, Ukraine did what it calls Operation Spiderweb, which was in planning for a month and a half plus 9 days, for a year and a half plus 9 days. So Operation Spiderweb targeted Russia's nuclear-capable aircraft. The Ukrainians claim more than 40 aircraft have been either hit or been destroyed. And these attacks have happened over a wide geographical range. The furthest targets were separated by about 7,000 kilometers. So that is massive, right? Then there's been the latest attack, Ukrainian attack on the Kerch bridge that connects Russia to the Crimean Peninsula. And it's the third such major attack on the Kerch bridge. And this, you can say, is Russia's symbolic link to Crimea, and actually Russia's vital umbilical link to Crimea. It's the vital artery that connects Russia with Crimea. And Russia legally, according to Russia, Crimea now legally belongs to Russia, and it has been annexed in 2014. So it's been more than 11 years. And now I'm not sure if it's happened thus far, but Ukraine has been given the green signal by the West, by NATO, to use long range missiles and weapons against Russia. So there could be long range strikes on Russia by Ukraine using NATO supplied missiles and weapons. So that's where this all comes in. So Operation Spiderweb was apparently a great success. It hit 5 Russian air bases, strategic bomber bases, which were targeted over vast distances. At least, I mean, the two furthest locations targets were approximately 7,000 kilometers apart. More than 100 FPV, first person view drones were used by Ukraine in coordinated waves. And the Ukrainians claim that about 41 Russian military aircraft, including strategic bombers, were either hit or destroyed. Now, this is a strike at Russia's capability to respond militarily, not just militarily, but through the nuclear option. So the question, therefore, is: did Operation Spiderweb cross a Russian nuclear red line according to the amended and new nuclear doctrine? So, look, on paper, it did. On paper, Operation Spiderweb did cross Russia's nuclear threshold according to the new doctrine. So the operation targeted nuclear capable bombers, which are part of Russia's strategic deterrent. And attacks on multiple air bases do, by any standards, qualify as a massive conventional strike on conventional or on critical Russian infrastructure. And it looks like Western weapons were probably used in some strikes, which once again fits Russia's clause that the attack was backed by a nuclear power, which is NATO. Right now, what's the Russian response been thus far? So it looks like Operation Spiderweb crossed a Russian nuclear red line. It looks like that. So what's the Russian response been like? So the rhetoric has been pretty strong, pretty warlike, pretty bellicose, but the retaliation thus far has been, as we know, it's been conventional. And there is no observable change that we can detect, that we can discern in Russia's nuclear alert status. And there have been intensified missile strikes by Russia on Ukrainian cities instead of any form of nuclear escalation thus far. Thus far. So then, what's the real nuclear threshold for Russia? I mean, theoretical versus practical, doctrinal versus actual, on paper versus in real life. What's the real nuclear threshold? So the theoretical threshold has been breached on paper, but it looks like the real world threshold probably is higher for Russia. Otherwise, you don't wait, right? Once your nuclear red lines are breached. So, what is the thought process, the calculation, the calculus that may be behind Mr. Putin's, you know, what's going on? So, most likely nuclear weapons. I mean, it makes sense. It's logical. It's sensible to reserve nuclear weapons for national survival threats, not for an embarrassment like this. I mean, Operation Spiderweb was a massive embarrassment for Russia. Clearly, massive security breach, massive intelligence failure, massive failure all around, and very visible global embarrassment. So it is not something that threatens Russia's survival. It is not something that threatens Russia's sovereignty. It is a significant embarrassment. It has had an effect, the effect of, to some extent, denting Russia's ability to strike at Ukraine and other nations if required. Right. So about between 20 to 30% of Russia's strategic bomber strike force may have been destroyed if 41 planes were destroyed. But it doesn't cripple Russia's ability to strike back at its potential adversaries. So it's an embarrassment. It's definitely a big setback, but it is not a national security threat. It's not a national survival threat, and it's not a threat to Russia's sovereignty. So the actual threshold may still be as per the old doctrine. Hmm? But now there's a growing risk. So Ukraine seems to have tested blood. They did the Operation Spiderweb, then they went ahead and struck the Kerch Bridge. After that, they seem to have struck at railway networks and all that in Russia. And Russia is characterizing this as terrorism. And each of these strikes, each of these deep strikes, increases the risk of miscalculation. As Moscow's nuclear doctrine does provide cover for a nuclear response to such threats and such events, right? So now, the Kerch Bridge attacks. Let's take a look at these. So the first one happened in October 2022. It used a truck bomb and it damaged a part of the roadway section, okay, of the Kerch Bridge. The second attack happened in July 2023. It used naval drones and hit pillars of the bridge, but the bridge is continued to be more or less operational. Now, just a few days ago, June 2025, the third attack happened with a massive 1,000 kilo plus underwater explosive charge, which was detonated against a support pillar of the bridge. And now the Ukrainians are claiming that the bridge is crippled. The Russians seem to be claiming that the bridge is still okay for use, but it's the third such strike, and so it could. So then the question is, does this? We clearly understand that Operation Spiderweb crossed one of Russia's nuclear red lines. What about the Kerch Bridge attack? Did it also cross a red line? So this series of attacks, especially the last one, it has not explicitly crossed the Russian nuclear doctrine. So it's as you can see, it's a pinpoint infrastructure strike. It's not a large scale attack on Russian territory or Russian civilians or Russian military forces. It's a pinpoint attack on a piece of Russian infrastructure. And Russia has retaliated with conventional missile barrages on Ukrainian infrastructure. Russia has not retaliated with nuclear threats in response to the Kerch Bridge attack. Uh, and the Russian politician Mr. Dmitry Medvedev had in the past issued nuclear threats on Twitter, like Judgment Day and all, vis-a-vis the Crimean Peninsula and the Kerch Bridge. So such rhetoric has been seen, but despite such rhetoric about attacks on Crimea, the reality was that the Russian response was kind of muted. So it's not explicitly across a Russian nuclear red line, the Kerch Bridge attack. Now, then there's the question of Western long range weapons that Ukraine may potentially use. There's a significant possibility, maybe 70-80%, that Ukraine will likely use these long range weapons in the next 7 to 15 days. So these restrictions were gradually lifted by the US, by the West, by NATO. The US allowed ATACMS, Atacams, which is a 300-kilometer range weapon. They allowed the strikes using this weapon inside Russia in late 2024. And now they have allowed Ukraine, they have given Ukraine the go ahead to use longer range weapons. So this means that Ukraine now has a deep strike capability. Ukraine can now target Russia's military industrial complex deep within Russia's territory, deeper inland in Russia. Infrastructure, military infrastructure, industrial infrastructure, maybe civilian infrastructure, we'll see, right? And this change that happened in late 2024, the US allowing Ukraine to use this weapon, that is what prompted Russia's amendment of its nuclear doctrine. Now the question is, would such Western enabled strikes cross Russia's red lines? So now Russia's amended doctrine explicitly says that attacks from non-nuclear states backed by nuclear powers will be treated as a joint attack on Russia. So that's clear. So if Ukraine uses a long-range weapon supplied by NATO against Russia, then Russia will treat this as an attack that is a joint attack on Russia, which involves a nuclear power. But does that still cross a red line? So if there's Western involvement, which means that Ukraine uses a long-range Western weapon, then from Russia's perspective, it means that these attacks are equivalent to an attack by a Western country or multiple Western countries on Russian territory. So once again, does it really breach The nuclear red lines. Okay, a bunch of Western countries have, let's say, collectively attacked Russian territory. But does it cross Russia's red lines? Does it forget about the existential threat to the Russian nation? But does it constitute an attack on Russian, a threat to Russia's sovereignty? Most likely not, unless it's a really large scale attack. So the practical reality is that the actual response from Russia depends on the scale of the Ukrainian strikes and the effect that the Ukrainian strikes have. What's the result? What's the end result? How much damage do these strikes cause for Russia? So the thing is that we are moving up the escalation ladder. The more Ukraine strikes deep within Russia's heartland, the more Mr. Putin may feel cornered. Right now, Russia is on the back foot, it's on the defensive, it's been embarrassed, it's suffered a significant series of setbacks. And Ukraine is on the front foot. Mr. Zelensky seems to have the cards that Mr. Trump was asking for. So Mr. Putin may feel cornered. And if this continues, there could be a decision somewhere from Mr. Putin about potentially, you know, considering the use of nuclear weapons. Now, when it comes to NATO has been doing this balancing act. So NATO has it's enhanced, it's increased the monitoring, its monitoring activities to detect any potential Russian nuclear moves. After this doctrine changed, they've had to do this, right? And NATO officials say that they have seen no imminent signs of Russian nuclear use, despite whatever is being said. And NATO is, let's say, refusing Russian nuclear threats, or what they call Russian nuclear blackmail. They said that we have seen no reason, we've not seen any reason to adjust our own nuclear posture. And support for Ukraine, what they call Ukraine's self-defense, continues. They're supplying weapons and whatnot to Ukraine. And this includes Ukrainian strikes on military targets inside Russia. So NATO is walking a fine line between supporting Ukraine and avoiding a direct NATO-Ukraine war. And that's been, and we are inching closer to a direct NATO-Russia war. And they'll try and push Russia as far as they can, try. They'll probably you'll see calibrated Ukrainian strikes deeper into Russian territory, and then they'll see what's the response. They'll wait and see what's the response. If that did not evince any major response, they'll try and go a little further. So that's the fine line they're crossing, and they're testing how far they can go. So that's the balancing act that NATO is doing. Now, what's the bottom line on these nuclear red lines? So we've had technical violations of the Russian nuclear red lines. Western-enabled deep strikes fit Russia's nuclear use scenario. And in case any kind of Western technology was used during Operation Spiderweb, it already does fit Russia's nuclear use scenario. And it did strike at Russia's capability to deliver nuclear weapons on its own. So, yeah, definitely we have technically crossed a Russian nuclear red line. But practically, Russia has been restrained. So it looks like the actual use of nuclear weapons, it still remains unlikely, but the risk is higher now after what has happened. And Russia is posturing, its messaging, it is issuing warnings to NATO, and this aims to deter NATO support for Ukraine for further deep strikes into Russia. Now the question is, how might Russia respond to what has already happened thus far? Right? Ukraine has had multiple successes now, a string of multiple military and covert operation successes, and this has put Russia under pressure to respond. I mean, if they don't respond, credibility is gone, and your opponents will feel like they can really, press the matter home. So Russia is under pressure to respond. So let's take a look at three logical scenarios for Russian responses. Earlier this week in episode 1, I gave three potential scenarios for what Russia could do in response to Operation Spiderweb. But then you had more operations that Ukraine has done. So Russia is under more pressure now. So let's amend the scenarios a little bit. Right? So the first scenario is intensified conventional warfare, which is escalated missile strikes by Russia and troop surges maybe into Ukrainian territory. That's number one. That's scenario A. Scenario B is a strategic pause for whatever reason. Maybe the Russia seeks a diplomatic off ramp with nuclear posturing. And there's a scenario C, which is an extreme escalation scenario, which involves the limited limited use of nuclear weapons or a direct conflict with NATO. So let's examine briefly scenario A, which is intensified conventional warfare. I think there's a high likelihood, about 60% of this happening, and this will most likely happen within the next 30 to 60 days, next month or two. It may happen immediately also, right? Um, so what may happen? You may have increased sabotage operations, covert operations, just like what Ukraine did. Russia may do the same thing within Ukraine, or there could be assassination attempts against Ukrainian leadership, possibly. Yeah, there could be military actions, of course, escalated missile strikes, escalated drone strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure. There could be a potential possible troop surge. They could mobilize more troops, and there could be land-based incursions into Ukraine, maybe through Sumy or somewhere else. And there will be diplomatic messaging in this scenario from Russia that Western support is causing the escalation. It is Western provocations done through Ukraine that are causing the provocation, and Russia will try to erode whatever existing international support exists for Ukraine. So that's scenario A. What is scenario B? It's got about a 30% probability. It's a medium likelihood scenario. A strategic pause. So it's quite strange the way Russia has behaved in this war. It's got a massive it's got massive military strength, but it has allowed this war to meander, to drift, to become a frozen conflict, to become a long war scenario. It has, in the very beginning of the war, in the first month after the war started, Russian troops had reached the outskirts of Kiev, but they pulled back. So it looks like Russia wants the war to continue for as long as needed, and that has ended up possibly putting Russia on the back foot now, right? So there's a medium likelihood of this scenario. So it could happen in the next, a month to 3 months, if there's a further stalemate on the battlefield. So Russia may want to seek a diplomatic off ramp to freeze the fighting and solidify the current territorial holdings. Russia has captured about between a fifth and a fourth of Ukrainian territory. They would want to solidify that, right? And this will obviously come with more nuclear signaling and warnings as leverage. Russia has the means to back up any claims they make from the nuclear perspective, and Russia may do visible nuclear exercises or forward deployment of tactical nuclear weapons, right? And the objective will be to pressurize Ukraine and the West into negotiations through fear. That's a legitimate tactic in warfare. So this is scenario B, which has in my opinion, 30% probability, based on the way things have gone for Russia thus far in the past week or so. Now, what's the last scenario? That is extreme escalation. Now, that's a scenario nobody wants to see. It's got a low likelihood, less than 10%. I hope. Yeah, that's how I see it. And this scenario is very unlikely in the next 6 months, in my opinion. And I hope I am right. It's very unlikely unless Russia faces catastrophic defeat. I don't see Russia, and that's why the scenario is so unlikely. I do not see Russia facing catastrophic defeat. Russia will not be in a scenario where it faces catastrophic defeat as long as it's Ukraine that's fighting Russia. If NATO troops get involved, then once again, I still don't know if that will be enough for Russia to face catastrophic defeat. That's why I think it's a very low probability scenario. So, what happens in this scenario? There is demonstrative nuclear use, maybe a high altitude burst over the Black Sea or some uninhabited areas. It's a shock factor without any massive casualties, but as a dire warning. Look out now. That's enough. You have crossed our red lines, and we mean business now. And no atmospheric nuclear explosion has happened in decades, right? So this would be an absolute shock factor if this happens. If that doesn't deter the situation, that doesn't solve the problem for Russia, then there could be a tactical military strike, maybe against a military target or a remote area, as a terrifying warning. A tactical military strike is a low yield warhead, which is uh, which is delivered using a short range, generally a short range kind of missile. So if the demonstrative nuclear use doesn't work, then there could be a tactical nuclear strike. And then there could be a direct attack on NATO facilities that are supporting Ukraine, maybe within Ukraine itself, or maybe outside of Ukraine. Who knows? Depending on the provocation on Russia, and this could then trigger NATO's Article 5. Then we are really, really close to nuclear exchange, which is World War III. So this is the last scenario, a very low likelihood scenario, extreme escalation, and I hope it never happens. But we have to discuss these possibilities. So this is kind of how close or how far we are from World War III. This scenario C, is a World War III scenario, and that's doomsday. So now, what are the response options that NATO has? So scenario A response, which is the most likely scenario, uh, NATO would redouble its air defenses for Ukraine and accelerate advanced weapons deliveries for Ukraine. That's under the most likely scenario. For scenario B, which is Russia seeking a diplomatic off ramp while still making issuing nuclear warnings, in that case, NATO could maintain that Ukraine alone decides when to negotiate if Russia seeks negotiations, and NATO would most likely refuse to yield to Russia's nuclear threats and warnings. And in the case of scenario C, well, once again, if Russia is forced to do this, NATO hopefully doesn't resort to a tit for tat nuclear exchange. Instead, they could have multiple options like intensifying sanctions against Russia, which is a performative thing because sanctions have already exceeded all limits, but maybe performatively intensifying sanctions on Russia, maybe direct military action against Russian forces if NATO is capable of doing that. Maybe they could deploy Poland into action, maybe something else. So that is scenario C. So once again, if these are the steps NATO takes, then we are still not crossing the threshold of World War III, right? Um, and obviously, they will continue to send out the right messaging, continue support despite threats, and prepare contingencies while attempting to call Mr. Putin's bluff. So yeah, these are the options that NATO has. So this is overall how close or how far we are from World War III. Ukraine is the only flashpoint in the world, in my opinion, right now, that could precipitate a global war, a nuclear exchange of some kind. I think we are still in safe territory, but it is Ukraine that's going to determine whether we go into more dangerous territory or not. It's Ukraine's actions, it's Mr. Zelensky's actions that are going to determine how how much closer we come to scenario C, which is the nightmare scenario. So right now we're still okay. Right now World War III is not happening, and we never want it to happen. But it will all be based on what happens in the next few days. What actions does Ukraine take? Russia will most likely respond forcibly to what Ukraine has done. And then what does Ukraine do in response? And so on. So it's going to continue, and one hopes that, there's a diplomatic solution of some kind. So ideally, we want scenario B, a diplomatic solution in which Ukraine, agrees to negotiate, and maybe there's some kind of settlement. Maybe Mr. Trump gets involved or something. So ideally, we want a diplomatic resolution and a ceasefire, and then hopefully an end to this conflict. We do not want scenario C. That's where we are vis-a-vis World War III. Now, let us discuss emerging threats to India, asymmetric threats to India, drone threats to India, the emerging drone warfare situation and scenario in the Indian subcontinent. And what are the lessons that we learn from Ukraine? And what are the implications for the India Pakistan situation? So we've already learned lots of lessons from what's happened the past 3 or so years in Ukraine, and even before that during the Nagorno-Karabakh war. But what are lessons we can learn from what happened in the past week? It's really alarming what has happened in the past week. And this, believe me, you got to believe it, that this has set off alarm bells. This would have set off alarm bells. I am not privy to any classified information, but I can guarantee that this will have set off alarm bells in India's defense establishment. So let's take a look at what the deal is. First of all, let's do a quick recap of what's happened in the past month, right? The 3-day war, the India-Pakistan 3-day conflict, Operation Sindoor, which began on the 7th of May and was paused on the 10th of May. We're almost there. It's almost a month now. So there was this 3-day 3 days of warfare, brief but intense military clash. It was mainly an aerial war, and the entire border, or including the LOC between India and Pakistan, stretching from Kashmir and Ladakh all the way to Gujarat in the south, it was active. And hundreds of drones, probably more than 1,000 Pakistani drones, were intercepted by India. And this is the first drone war that has occurred in the Indian subcontinent. So, what was India's approach like during this 3 day war? So, India conducted precise pinpoint strikes on Pakistani targets using Israeli made kamikaze drones, which is the II Harop drones. And India hit a large number of Pakistani terror hubs, terrorist infrastructure. Um, India successfully neutralized Pakistani air defense radar near Lahore. Um, and India's strategy allowed India to strike at Pakistan without risking piloted aircraft, and this ensured that the escalation was managed under the nuclear threshold. And eventually, India ended up calling Pakistan's nuclear bluff, and Pakistan's nuclear blackmail is now a thing of the past, essentially, because India hit Pakistan so hard in so many places, in so many vital installations, Rawalpindi and where not, the heart of the Pakistani military terrorist infrastructure complex, and Pakistan had no response. Now, what was Pakistan's strategy to to respond? To how did Pakistan respond to the Indian strikes on their infrastructure, terrorist and military infrastructure? So Pakistan launched waves of cheap, expendable drones across the border, hundreds and hundreds of drones every night. They attempted to saturate India's air defenses and probe India's air defenses with several hundred drones. And it looks like they used a large number of basic unarmed models as decoys while hiding armed drones inside the swarm. And we saw the footage, all of us, right, of the Indian air defenses taking out drone after drone after drone. So that was Pakistan's strategy. Now let's compare this with Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb. And what does it mean for India's security? So, like we've discussed in the past 2-3 days, Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb was under planning for about 18 plus months. And 117 FPV, first person view drones, were launched in waves. Ukraine claims more than 40 Russian high value aircraft, strategic bombers were destroyed or damaged, including at least a couple of early warning aircraft, right? And if the number was 40 plus, then it has a 34% impact, a 34% attrition of Russia's strategic missile platforms, aircraft that can launch nuclear missiles or cruise missiles, which have nuclear warheads potentially. So that's been the impact. So this was low cost, high impact warfare that was demonstrated by Ukraine. It was a military raid. The military raid is an old, long-standing European tradition that goes back all the way to the 19th century and even before. And you've seen that during the First World War and the Second World War and so on. So Ukraine transformed the nature of the military raid through drones. So this was a 21st century military raid by Ukraine. So the drones the Ukrainians used were pretty cheap drones. The cost was between $600 and $1,000. And these were improvised FPV drones, and they ended up destroying billion-dollar military assets. The drones were smuggled into Russia, hidden in trucks. They bypassed all the layered air defenses. The air defenses are looking at the sky, and the truck is on the highway, so no one cares and looks at the truck. So this bypassed all the Russian layered air defenses, and the drones apparently had image recognition capabilities, AI enabled capabilities that identified weak points in bombers for maximum damage. So you will see that bombers in the Russian bombers had tires, etc., on them. So the drones made sure that they evaded the areas where there were tires, and they hit at the weaker points on the aircraft, which was the intention was to cause the maximum amount of damage. And many of these drones, they flew via the 4G or LTE networks, Russian telecommunications networks, with semi-autonomous navigation. So I think the end stage was autonomous, maybe not, but it was supposedly semi-autonomous navigation. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the Kerch Bridge incident, the Kerch Bridge attack by Ukraine. So Ukrainian agents, secret agents, they secretly planted explosive charges on underwater support pillars right under the nose of Russia, right? And more than 1,000 kilograms of explosives detonated against bridge supports at 4:44 a.m. So that's precision execution. And this was a third distinct method used to attack this bridge after a truck bomb in 2022 and naval drones in 2023. This time it was Ukrainian agents that probably dived under the bridge. And how did they carry 1,000 plus kilos of explosive and they were never caught? So very uh, successful operation. Now, what are the implications? Now, let's come back to the Pakistan angle for India. What's Pakistan's history been like vis-a-vis India? So Pakistan has a history of using terrorism as state policy. Pakistan has pursued this strategy or this policy of bleeding India with 1,000 cuts via state-sponsored terrorist proxies. Pakistan is the world's epicenter of terrorism. It has terrorism as its state policy against India. What's terrorism? Attacking and targeting and attacking innocent civilians, not the other nation's government assets or military assets. Targeting civilians. That is terrorism. So Pakistan has had this policy of targeting innocent civilians. And we've had so many major attacks in India. The most visible of these was the 2008 Mumbai attacks, which killed 166 people at least, maybe more. Lashkar-e-Toiba was the terrorist organization that did that. One terrorist was captured, Ajmal Kasab, who you see on the screen. And that's how everything came out, the Pakistani involvement and all that. And I've discussed that in the past. I discussed that yesterday as well. Recently, you had another organization called Jaish-e something, which claimed the 2019 Pulwama attack that killed 40 Indian troops, and it gave rise to the cross-border strikes by India, the Balakot airstrikes. And the Pakistani terrorist tactics have evolved, and they've used a wide range of methods, from suicide raids, Fidayin raids, to improvised explosive device bombings, border infiltration, and so much more. They've done train attacks, they've done all kinds of things all across India. So that's how Pakistan's tactics have evolved. Now, what have been the strategic costs of Pakistani terrorism? So first of all, the Pakistanis have had successes. I mean, they managed to have the entire indigenous Hindu population of Kashmir evicted from Kashmir, right? In the late 1980s and early 1990s. And there was this insurgency in Kashmir that went on for a very long time. It's something that you could say perhaps still kind of exists below the surface, potentially. One hopes not, but yeah, we've got to be careful. So this Kashmir insurgency tied down Indian troops and exacted a steady toll, ongoing. And it tied down our troops in Kashmir. Large number of troops were tied down. You have to maintain the troop numbers. They have to keep on doing the patrolling. And there's always some kind of incident, some terrorist encounter and attack here and there. And there's this steady toll that you have to pay as a consequence. And then the Pakistanis, apart from this, in addition to this, they did multiple major terror strikes over time, every few months, every few years. Earlier, it was every few weeks. Then it became every few months. Now it's every few years. And the objective of these terrorist strikes was to grab international attention and to pressurize India diplomatically. And the objective was to internationalize the so-called Kashmir issue. So these attacks kept on bringing Kashmir back into the international spotlight. What were the long-term consequences for Pakistan? What have they been? So Pakistan has gained a well-earned reputation as a sponsor of terrorism, as the world's epicenter of terrorism. They are the nation that harbored Osama bin Laden, right? And as a consequence, they've faced international sanctions, but they've still been very useful to the United States, which has historically funded this terrorism. So, but they have also been sanctioned by the US. It's a love-hate relationship. It's that sort of complicated relationship. The nation of Pakistan was grey-listed for a while by the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, because of terrorist groups openly operating on Pakistani territory. I mean, you could not hide it. It was that visible, it was that open. And India's responses have grown more forceful. It started with this surgical strikes, a small number of special forces crossing the LOC and taking out some terrorists. That happened. That was the surgical strikes. It was a very low key, low profile operation, but successful nonetheless. Then you had Balakot, in which India conducted airstrikes on a terrorist camp in Balakot, crossed the Pakistani airspace, went deep into Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, wiped out a terrorist camp. But we did not show evidence of what we did. We did not film the airstrikes and so on. And then the next day there was this aerial battle between India and Pakistan, in which we lost one aircraft, and our guy was captured, wing commander Abhinandan, but we made the Pakistanis give him back. So that's what happened in 2019 Balakot. And then Operation Sindoor was a different dimension of warfare, and Pakistan was completely and comprehensively hammered. So India's responses have grown increasingly more forceful and more decisive. Pakistan was forced to beg for a surrender, for a ceasefire, for a pause in the fighting last month. It was rendered completely defenseless. So Pakistan, as a consequence of all these actions, has kind of been left internationally isolated, and economically, Pakistan's economy is an absolute mess. The IMF and the World Bank have to keep bailing Pakistan out over and over again. So that's a constant cycle for Pakistan. The West keeps bailing Pakistan out because Pakistan is useful to the West, because the West needs to keep India off balance and doesn't want India to grow too much. Now, so that's the context. Now let's focus on India's Far East, Manipur. There has been drone warfare on Indian citizens by Kuki terrorists. In November 2023, the capital city of Manipur, Imphal, saw its airport being shut down for flight operations after multiple drones were detected in the airspace. And in September 2024, more than 40 bombs were dropped by drones, by Kuki operated drones, on various villages in Imphal West. And it killed at least one person, a 31-year-old woman. And the drones these terrorists have been using have a 15-kilometer range, apparently. And they are also used, so these drones are being used alongside sniper fire, and rocket propelled grenades, RPGs. So Indian citizens are possibly even now being targeted by drones used by Kuki terrorists in India's Far East, in Manipur. So what was found? What were the results of the investigation done about the Kuki drone operations? So the NIA and Manipur police uncovered the supply network. They traced these drones to suppliers in Delhi and Haryana. Okay, interesting. And these drones were then supplied to individuals who were working for who were Kuki terrorists. Terrorists have overground and underground operatives. So various Manipur-based Kuki terrorist overground sympathizers were implicated in this, and they were organizing the procurement and deployment of these drones for use against civilians by the Kuki terrorists. And various high-level committees, etc., were formed to study and counter this evolving Kuki terrorist drone threat. So it's not like we have not seen this before. It's already happening over there, but nobody cares about India's Far East. So this never made it as a big thing in the Indian media. Imagine the capital city of a state being targeted by drones, and drones being dropped on civilians in the capital city of a state. But the India's media did not pay attention to this. But you see that the threat has already arrived in India. Now, with that in mind, Pakistan is conventionally way weaker than India. Even from the nuclear perspective, Pakistan can't match India. But Pakistan has always used asymmetric strategies. So Pakistan will now most likely want to integrate the use of drones into their terrorist tactics, especially after what we have seen happen the past week or so. Operation Spiderweb and the attack on the Kerch Bridge. So, with the evident success of drones, very clear success of drones in Ukraine, Pakistan's military planners, who are terrorists, who work with terrorists, they may look to draw inspiration from Ukrainian tactics. So then, what would that look like? Right? One such strategy or tactic would be swarm saturation attacks. So you deploy drones in large numbers, like a cloud of mosquitoes, a swarm of mosquitoes or locusts, large scale drone swarms to probe and penetrate Indian airspace. So at this point in time, over here, what you're seeing here, we're talking about military tactics. You send large scale drone swarms to probe and penetrate Indian airspace. And these drones are typically pretty cheap, and the logic would be that, you use these hobby drones, cheap hobby drones, to force India to fire missiles which cost $100,000 a piece. Of course, India has used the Bofor's L-70 gun, which has rounds that are cheaper than the drone. So India had already planned for this. But yeah, in case India has to use missiles, then it's a very favorable exchange ratio. And Pakistan is in the process, has already acquired such drones from its allies, like-minded nations like Turkey and China. So in the future, they will have most likely larger drone swarms in the future, right? And this can attack this can act as psychological warfare against India and strategic signaling against India. So that's one strategy or strategy they could use. What's the next one? Covert deep strikes deep inside Indian territory with drones. Now, please understand that I am not divulging any sensitive information or any classified information. All of this is open source information based on what's already happened. Okay, so they could. This is called looking at various scenarios and what's the threat potential of these scenarios. So then they could do covert deep strikes into India with drones. So you could have drones being smuggled, or maybe drone components being smuggled across the LOC or through the porous border, wherever it is. So border infiltration, and you smuggle drones into India. And then you would have local terrorist cells or sympathizer cells who will assemble and prepare the drones within Indian territory. And then they could do surprise launches of these drones from inside India, which will drastically shorten detection time. So if you are looking at the border and you expect things to come from there, drones flying in or whatever, then you're ready, you're alert. But what if the drones are launched from within India? Then the time that you have to detect them before they hit whatever targets is much shorter, right? And then using these tactics, the Pakistani terrorists could could potentially want to strike at parked aircraft, at radar sites, military sites, command centers for maximum impact. Now, over here, we're talking about military targets. Okay. But what other high value infrastructure could Pakistan potentially target? They could target transport infrastructure, bridges and tunnels on vital routes like the Jammu Srinagar highway, right? They could target power systems, dams, electrical substations, which would cause, if they target a dam, for example, I mean, they would be wise not to, but that would cause flooding. If they target electrical substations, that would cause blackouts. Right? They could, if the Pakistanis get their hands on maritime underwater drones, then they could target maritime assets like ports or naval vessels. India will have to be cognizant of all these threats now. The world has changed tremendously. And then obviously there's the rail networks. India India's rail network is probably the largest in the world, if I'm not mistaken. So railway bridges, railway tracks, and so on, to disrupt military logistics. But of course, this has a civilian effect. Correct. Now, what next? Then there is targeted terror attacks with drones. So strikes on urban centers. It's been seen hundreds of times on the Ukrainian battlefields. Small drones that are available online. These can carry grenades or various kinds of shaped explosive charges, and this can be used so easily to target crowded markets or political events or whatever VIP events, right? And then you can do this on civilian various symbolic targets. So, for example, when the Operation Sindoor happened, the Pakistanis tried to target the Golden Temple. They definitely hit a Gurudwara, and they tried to hit churches and so on. They wanted to, create religious tensions and strife in India. So, terrorists could target religious buildings to incite communal fear, to destabilize India, and then to claim that India, is oppressive and so on. And through these means, the terrorists, Pakistani terrorists, or their sympathizers, or their sleeper cells within India, could strike deep into Indian cities, which were previously out of reach for people who cross the border or the LOC. And this is psychologically frightening. Terror from the sky. You never know what's gonna come. Yet it'll come without warning. So it'll strike fear into the hearts of the population, and that's what terrorism is all about. And then there is this problem. Millions of illegal immigrants, infiltrators, as force multipliers for Pakistan. We know that there are, I don't know how many millions of Bangladeshis in India. In 2014, the government had put out a statement that there are 50 million illegal Bangladeshis in India. That's 11 years ago. Imagine what the number would be today. The border has remained open more or less, right? So imagine 100 million Bangladeshis. God knows how many Rohingyas. God knows how many cookies and even Pakistanis in India. And these people are all across our cities, all across our country. They're embedded everywhere. They live in slums. Every city has slums apparently, and every slum has these people. So they are everywhere. There are these settlements, these ghettos near airports. Can you think of an airport which has these illegal settlements nearby? I can think of many. You will have such illegal settlements near military airports and military bases as well, near ports. This is a ticking time bomb for India. And these folks, these Rohingyas and Bangladeshis, I mean, it is known that Rohingya individuals were in the process of establishing Al Qaeda networks in India. Thus far, 64% apparently of the India-Bangladesh border has been fenced, despite decades of efforts, because the border areas are pretty very difficult to fence for geographical and topographical, etc. reasons. Then these folks have fake counterfeit documents, identity documents. Most of them have Aadhaar cards and whatnot, right? So Rohingya camps are notorious for this. And then it was found that Jamaat ul Mujahideen Bangladesh cells activated with Pakistani supports were using these immigrant enclaves, which is these ghettos, these slums where the immigrants live openly in India. This is a major security threat for India. So this is something the government really needs to do something about. Absolutely really needs to do something about. This is a ticking time bomb. These individuals who have absolutely no allegiance to India, the nation, to the culture, to the civilization, they are enemies within. Every illegal should be deported at the earliest. Now, how could Pakistan's asymmetric tactics, terrorism tactics evolve? Right? What's the potential? So, and why could it be really attractive for Pakistan to use the tactics that are visible in Ukraine, drones and so on? So, first of all, it's really cost effective. Use technology. Technology becomes a force multiplier. Instead of sending people across the LOC, across the border, you can use these cheap, innovative tactics. You have sleeper cells within India. You have Rohingyas, Bangladeshis, God knows what in India. You have them carry out attacks for you. So these cheap, innovative tactics can be very frustrating for a conventionally stronger opponent. India has always been conventionally much more powerful than Pakistan, and yet Pakistan has succeeded in repeatedly bleeding India through this strategy of a million cuts. Now they could use these technological tactics, right? And if you use drones, they provide plausible deniability. I mean, how do you know it's a Pakistani drone? How do you know Pakistan is behind it, right? If it happens in some city somewhere in India, absolute plausible deniability. And this can so easily and so So beautifully for Pakistan, bypass and avoid India's conventional military advantages. This is not a military operation at all. This is a completely asymmetric operation. And how do you defend against that, right? So, what are the kind of Indian targets that are vulnerable to all these things? So, if Pakistan were to employ these methods, a range of Indian targets could be at risk, from drone strikes or covert sabotage, like the Kerch Bridge operation, military bases, obviously, air bases, radar stations, command centers, etc., critical infrastructure like power grids, like bridges, transportation networks, civilian targets like airports. Imagine that Imphal airport came under threat. So airports, railways, crowded areas, symbolic sites, naval assets, ports, ships, submarines, maritime facilities. In some Indian cities, you have submarines right next to where tourists are wandering around. I mean, yeah. So very vulnerable targets exist in India, and this is something the government has to be really, really. They have to do something very rapidly about this. We'll come to that. Then there are military targets like air bases and radar. So there are forward air bases, Pathankot, Srinagar, Jodhpur, near the western border. These will be vulnerable to Pakistani drone swarms that come from across the border, right? Parked aircraft, fuel depots, radar antennas. These present lucrative targets. Pakistan will want to strike back after the disaster of Operation Sindoor, right? And so, what Ukraine achieved during Operation Spiderweb, it demonstrates the threat to stationary planes. And conventionally, historically, we have kept a large number of planes in one place, right? And then there are air defense systems, critical radar sites, surface to air missile batteries. These could be struck easily by loitering munitions. And successful hits uh, on radars, etc., could blind India's coverage in that sector, which could open gaps for further strikes. So during the 2025 last month's 3-day war, India neutralized Pakistani radars near Lahore using similar tactics. And then what are the military targets? Army bases, naval bases, army camps, ammunition depots, naval vessels, command centers, all vulnerable to drone attacks, sabotage. Then civilian infrastructure, vital railway bridges connecting Kashmir are vulnerable to Kerch Bridge style sabotage. Rail junctions and tunnels like the Pir Panjal are choke points for transport. Then coordinated drone attacks, sending a swarm of drones to target a substation. This could trigger widespread blackouts. Then refineries in border states are flammable targets for drone strikes, right? And then there are symbolic and civilian targets, public gatherings, festivals, rallies, sporting events, religious congregations, where drones could cause havoc, casualties, panic, religious sites. So, like I said, during the May 3-day war, Pakistani drones targeted Sikh Gurudwaras, the Golden Temple, apparently, and churches to stoke communal tensions. Then, economic symbols like stock exchanges, IT hubs, these could be targeted to undermine investor confidence in India and economic stability. Imagine how wonderful it will be for Pakistan if they can achieve this. Then there are communication networks, telecommunications infrastructure, data centers, and so on, right? And then, of course, you so then what we see because of this is that India has robust defenses, and despite that, we now have vulnerabilities. This is an evolving uh, battle space situation, right? The battle space is evolving, and now we have, despite our robust defenses like the S-400 and so on, we have vulnerabilities. So, first of all, there's the surprise factor when it comes to a drone strike with drone swarms or whatever. The element of surprise and difficulty in detecting small drones, it creates inherent vulnerabilities. Many of these drones are dual use technologies. Commercial drones allow reconnaissance under the guise of civilian use. They also allow the dropping of of grenades and shaped explosives under the guise of civilian use. And even if you don't do that, you can do reconnaissance under the guise of civilian use. And so even temporary strikes can sow chaos. They can strain resources. They can score propaganda victories, and they can create damage to the morale of the nation. So, from frontline military bases to metropolitan hubs, everything could be in the crosshairs of these unmanned drone attacks. So, what could be the potential Indian countermeasures? What measures should India take to guard against these emerging threats? India needs to take proactive steps on multiple time horizons. Urgent measures, medium term measures, long term measures. Urgent measures are immediate tactical responses right away. Medium term measures are like things we should do in the next year to 3 years. And long term measures are strategic planning, 5 year plus strategic planning. But what's immediate and what's urgent? Let's take a look at that first. Urgent measure, border defense. We need to have a detection grid. We need to deploy low level radars, acoustic sensors, electro optical trackers along our borders. It'll cost a lot of money, it'll cost a lot of manpower. It has to be done. Then we need, now that we have the detection grid, we need interception systems. So mobile units with drone jamming guns, anti-aircraft weapons, network to radar like the L70 Bofors gun, super cheap and super effective. We need to have a lot more of those all over the place. We need rapid response teams, personnel equipped with laser dazzlers, jammers, and shotguns for close range defense if required, and multi-layered defense, multi-layered protection. Anti-drone dome needs to be created over critical border zones, not everywhere, but critical border zones using available technologies, all available technologies. Then more urgent measures, asset protection. We need physical hardening of aircraft shelters. So we need to implement netting over aircraft and fuel depots to mitigate damage from small explosives. So a simple net or wire mesh can prevent a drone from doing any damage. That's what we have learned from the Ukraine Russia war. Then we will need to use camouflage and deception. We need to use decoys to confuse incoming kamikaze drones, deploy smoke and screens during alerts, asset dispersal. We need to avoid concentrating aircraft and ammunition in one place. We have to disperse all of this now. And obviously, underwater security, we need to equip critical bridges with sensors and constant patrols, unfortunately, to detect drivers or underwater drones. This becomes a constant battle. But it is what it is. This is the new paradigm of warfare. More urgent measures are needed. Technology and intelligence, fast track procurement. We need to expedite acquisition of proven counter UAV systems from partners like maybe the US if they want to give, definitely Israel, maybe European nations, and so on. We must deploy radar jammer combos, radio frequency interception systems, and directed energy weapons. So I think we are making good progress on directed energy weapons, laser weapons, and so on. Deploy these, maybe other kinds of weapons, microwave or whatever. We need to bolster our offensive drone capabilities for deterrence through indigenous programs and imports, and we are doing very well on this stage. So we need to augment this. Then we need to have intelligence operations. We need to launch crackdowns on terror networks, smuggling routes that could enable drone attacks. We need to deport all the illegal infiltrators who are in India. We need to potentially think of banning civilian drone sales and purchases. I mean, why do civilians need drones? To shoot a wedding, to film a wedding. I should not use the word shoot here. To film a wedding, you film your wedding in a different way. Or maybe travel vloggers need drones for those aerial shots. Well, too bad. This is a national security issue. So potentially ban civilian drone sales and purchases. Then conduct rapid investigation of any drone sightings to recover debris and trace origins, and share intelligence with allies, maybe like-minded allies, maybe Russia, maybe Ukraine, or somebody who are experienced in countering drone threats. So that's something we could do. Then what are the medium-term initiatives, actions, steps we should take? Indigenous technology, research and development, investment. We need to fund DRDO. We need to fund Indian startups for develop tailored counter drones solutions. We need to create sophisticated drone jamming and spoofing technologies to disable these emerging drone threats. We need to have directed energy weapons. We need to develop portable lasers or microwave weapons to fry the drone circuitry and electronics. And we need to have now intercepted drones, drone on drone systems that chase and capture, maybe disable enemy UAVs. right? That's something we need to do. More medium term doctrine and training. We need to update our military doctrines, the air defense doctrine, military planning, etc., to address the drone threats. We need to form drone command units, specialized drone command units for offensive and defensive operations. We need to unify the army and the air force command, air defense systems under a single command. And we definitely need to include drone swarm scenarios in all our military exercises, because that's the warfare of the future. More medium term things we need to do: infrastructure protection. So beyond military sites, we have civilian infrastructure, right? So we need to harden civilian infrastructure and build redundancies to ensure that systems remain functional even if some individual targets are hit. Now, long term, first of all, military transformation. We need to have an unmanned systems force. We need to build indigenous drone fleets for various purposes: surveillance, attack capabilities, and so on. So, probably we need to have, apart from the army, navy, air force, we need to have a space force, and we probably need to have an unmanned systems force. We need to develop AI for faster than human response to drone threats, right? AI can operate independently of humans, that sort of thing. AI integration, and deploy high energy lasers. Deploy right now. Before that, we were talking about developing these systems. Once they are developed over the long term, we need to deploy these high energy lasers, which essentially offer limitless ammunition at light speed. So that takes care of any incoming drone swarm. More long term solutions: comprehensive security. We need to have a nationwide defense grid. We need to integrate radar coverage across civil aviation, air force, and weather radars to spot low flying targets. All of this needs to be integrated into a nationwide defense grid. And all the sensors need to be connected to a central command for immediate threat assessment and response coordination. It's called real time data sharing. You create an integrated view of which gives you full situational awareness wherever you are of the local conditions and threats. Then we need to have a regulatory framework. Maybe just ban the drones, but otherwise update the laws governing drone usage without stifling innovation in the growing sector. So you know what, you can have that, but there's no need to sell drones to civilians. You can have innovation in the sector, in the military sector. And then we can possibly have safe corridors, establish authorized drone routes with geofencing around critical areas, with automatic neutralization of intruders. So that's another thing we could do. Public resilience. We need to raise public awareness about drone threats and what the appropriate responses are. We can conduct community drills, exercises similar to fire drills for potential drone incidents. And we need to encourage our citizens to report suspicious drone activity. In the past, it used to be like, if you see an unclaimed bag somewhere, report it to the cops. Now it's going to be, if you see a drone anywhere, report it immediately to the authorities. But that needs to be ingrained in us. Because of all the terrorism India faced in the past 20 years, citizens in the past used to be like, the moment you see an unclaimed luggage somewhere, you would report it. Now that same automatic response needs to be there for drones that are spotted. So that needs to happen. So technology is the great leveler. New technologies are reshaping military and terrorist threats at a very rapid pace, unprecedented pace. And drones are now the integral, quintessential tool of 21st century warfare. They are super versatile, they are super low cost, and they are very precise. They're very hard to detect. So many advantages. And this can be used not just for military operations, but for terrorist operations. That's why it's asymmetric. It's the asymmetric nature of this technology blurs distinction between state militaries and non-state actors, which is terrorists. So a terrorist with an explosive drone can achieve strikes once only possible for an air force. Imagine that. One terrorist with an explosive drone can achieve only what only an air force could achieve before. Right? This is the sad democratization of destruction. And it requires nations, especially nations like India, who have so many adversaries, to be even more vigilant. So there is this strategic fluidity. There are new capabilities for India and new challenges also. So this wave of new technologies it offers opportunities as well as security headaches. In Pakistan, it gives Pakistan an asymmetric advantage. See, when you are determined to use terrorism, then it gives you an advantage. A nation like India doesn't use terrorism, but Pakistan is okay with terrorism, so it gives them this tremendous asymmetric advantage. Drones and proxies within India, they can allow Pakistan to hit above its weight, and this can offset India's conventional might. It can cause chaos in India, and this is the cat and mouse game. There's always this constant evolution of technology and capability. So offense and defense in drone warfare are it's a dance, it's a tango, it's in a continuous dance of measure and countermeasure. It's a cat and mouse game. And innovation is the most important thing. It's imperative. The battlefield is evolving, so must our countermeasures in speed, scale, and strategy. So the future of conflict is upon us now. Drones, AI, and robotics, and cyber tools. They enable small states, terrorist nations to punch above their weight. And these threats can target our homeland. Our homeland becomes vulnerable. These threats can bypass borders, they can bypass military front lines. They can strike directly into people's homes. So it's this applies not only for India but all nations that have similar threats. All nations, even if they don't see a threat, you know, nations need to blend traditional principles with cutting edge adaptations. And today, the cutting edge adaptations are evolving very rapidly. So this is the new normal, my friends. Drone warfare and high tech asymmetric tactics are here to stay. It's not going to go away after a while. This is not a passing phase. This is here to stay. And with that, we are at the end of today's episode 3 of Geostrategy with Abhijit Chavda. India faces this grave evolving threat, and the Indian government needs to be very cognizant of this. So, my friends, I hope this gave you some value. This is how we do actual deep dives, deep geostrategic analysis, deep threat analysis. This is how we do it. So if it brought you some value, please like, share, and subscribe. If you're a Pakistani, please feel free to not like, maybe dislike. It's up to you. But all Indians and all civilized people, please like. So if you have questions, I will see you momentarily in the upcoming Ask Abhijit live stream. Until and the next episode of Geostrategy will air on Monday, air live on Monday. So if that's what you want to see, I'll see you on Monday. If you have questions, I'll see you momentarily in Ask Abhijit. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you. Bye.